The sun rises slow and heavy over the farm, pouring gold over the fields. Dew glistens on the okra leaves, and the morning air hums with the promise of another hard, honest day. Miles Carter grips a basket in one hand, stretching his back as he surveys his land. His land. 5 acres of rolling green in a town that never quite welcomed him. It took years to get here, sweat, scraped knuckles, and more sleepless nights than he could count. But the farm is his sanctuary, a place where his father's lessons still echo in the wind. You don't ask permission to exist, boy. You take up space. A rooster crows, and he chuckles. All right, I hear you. As he kneels to pluck a ripe tomato, a slow-moving SUV rolls past his front gate. Too slow. Watching. He doesn't need to look up to know who it is. Margaret Ellison, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood HOA. White, wealthy, and wielding an iron grip over the community with the same energy as a plantation overseer. She's never liked him, never wanted a black farmer, ruining the aesthetic of her pristine, cookie-cutter neighborhood. Miles ignores her, forcing himself to focus on the weight of the produce in his hands. But the SUV lingers. Then, just as deliberately, it pulls off. Something's coming. He can feel it. The town of Willow Creek was never meant for people like Miles. Built on old money and older traditions, it's a place where black folks are either employees or cautionary tales. The few who own land keep their heads down, their roots shallow. But Miles? He planted deep. His farm sits just at the edge of the gated community, technically outside HOA jurisdiction, but close enough that Margaret and her circle of pearl clutchers act like it's their business. They've complained about the smell of manure, despite miles of open land between them. They've grumbled about unsightly farm equipment, even though he keeps it neat. And last week, a letter arrived. Your property is negatively impacting home values. Please consider alternative land use. Miles had laughed, crumpled it, and tossed it into the fire pit. That should have been the end of it. But the way Margaret's SUV crawled past his farm this morning, like a circling vulture, it tells him otherwise. His stomach tightens, a familiar, unwelcome knot. He's seen this play before. White folks with power don't ask. They move in silence, then strike. In the distance, the sound of sirens cuts through the morning peace. Faint, but growing louder. Miles exhales, staring toward the tree line. A storm is coming. The first sign that something is wrong comes just before noon. Miles is stacking wooden crates by the barn when he hears it, voices low and murmuring, just beyond his fence line. He straightens, wiping sweat from his brow, and catches a glimpse of movement through the trees. 2 figures, dressed in business casual, clipboard types. They don't belong. He steps forward, calling out, "Can I help you?" One of them, a man in khakis and a polo, flinches like he didn't expect to be caught. The woman beside him, blonde, sharp-featured, and wearing an expression like she just smelled something foul, tilts her chin up, assessing him like a bug under glass. Margaret. She gives him a tight, polished smile. "Mr. Carter, we were just assessing some concerns." Miles crosses his arms, muscles tensing. "Concerns?" The man clears his throat. "There's been some, questions about zoning regulations." He gestures vaguely at the land, as if it's an offense in itself. "Livestock, commercial activity, you understand." Miles knows exactly what this is. They're fishing, looking for a reason, any reason, to make his life harder. He forces his voice to stay even. This farm's been here longer than half the houses in that development. He turns to Margaret. "What's really going on?" Her smile doesn't waver. "Willow Creek has a certain standard, Mr. Carter. We all want what's best for the community." Miles grits his teeth. "We all, except him." "I don't answer to the HOA," he reminds her. "I'm not in your jurisdiction." Her expression tightens just a fraction. "Of course. But we still have a vested interest in property values. And let's be honest, this isn't exactly the kind of establishment most buyers want to see when they drive through the neighborhood." There it is. Not even pretending anymore. Miles exhales slowly, keeping his temper in check. "Unless you've got a legal reason to be here, I suggest you take your vested interests somewhere else. A muscle jumps in Margaret's jaw. She doesn't like being dismissed. But after a long moment, she steps back, adjusting her cardigan like shaking off dirt. Have a nice day, Mr. Carter. She turns sharply, leading Clipboard Guy back toward their car. The second they're gone, Miles pulls out his phone, snapping a picture of their retreating figures. Evidence. He doesn't trust them, not for a second. The air feels heavier now, tension creeping in like the heat before a storm. Then, that night, it happens. A bang against the barn door jerks him awake. He grabs his flashlight, heart pounding, and rushes outside, only to find his chicken coop open, the door swinging loose in the wind. Feathers scatter the dirt. His stomach drops. 3 of his best-laying hens are gone. Miles stares at the empty coop, anger simmering beneath his skin. The latch wasn't broken. It was opened. Deliberate. Someone did this on purpose. His mind races. The only people with a reason to target him are Margaret and her HOA goons. First the surprise zoning inspection. Now this? It's not a coincidence. The next morning, Miles drives straight to the HOA office, a sterile little building nestled between a coffee shop and a boutique that sells overpriced home decor. He steps inside, boots thudding against the polished floor, and finds Margaret behind a sleek glass desk, sipping tea like she owns the whole town. She looks up, and for a fraction of a second, something flickers in her eyes. Surprise? Annoyance? But she smooths it away with that practiced smile. Mr. Carter, she says, setting down her cup. What a surprise. How can I help you? Miles doesn't bother with pleasantries. 3 of my chickens were stolen last night. Coop door was wide open. Margaret tilts her head. How terrible. But what does that have to do with me? I don't know, Miles says, voice even. Maybe it's connected to that concerned assessment you did yesterday. Margaret exhales, like he's being unreasonable. I understand you're upset, but implying that I, or anyone from Willow Creek, had something to do with this is just unfair. Unfair. The word scrapes against his nerves. I want to see the HOA security footage, he says. Your cameras cover the entrance to the neighborhood. If someone was creeping around my farm, they would have had to pass through. Margaret leans back in her chair. I'm afraid that footage is private. HOA policy. Miles clenches his jaw. Of course. She smiles, all sympathy and condescension. Perhaps your property just isn't secure enough. Rural areas can attract all kinds of elements. Elements. The way she says it makes his skin crawl. Like he is the outsider, the problem. Miles nods slowly.
Right.
Appreciate your time. He turns and walks out before his temper gets the best of him. That night, he installs cameras around the property. He's not about to let Margaret or anyone else pull another stunt without proof. And proof comes faster than he expects. At 2 a.m., his phone buzzes, a motion alert. He jolts awake, grabbing his phone and clicking into the live feed. A figure, barely visible in the dark, is sneaking along the fence line. Miles throws on a hoodie, grabs his flashlight, and storms outside. The second he steps onto the porch, the figure bolts. Miles sprints after them, feet pounding against the dirt. They're fast, but Miles has been working this land for years. He knows every ditch, every slope. The runner miscalculates a turn, stumbles, and crashes to the ground. Miles' light catches them. It's Clipboard Guy. His face is pale, his breath ragged. Miles looms over him, adrenaline surging. What the hell are you doing on my property? Clipboard Guy scrambles up, backing away. I wasn't, You just what? The man shakes his head, panic in his eyes. I was checking. Miles steps forward. Checking what? Before the man can stammer another excuse, tires crunch against gravel. A car pulls up, headlights flooding the scene. Margaret. She steps out, perfectly composed despite the chaos. Miles, she says smoothly. Is there a problem? Miles gestures at Clipboard Guy. Caught him sneaking around my farm. Margaret sighs, as if he's the one being unreasonable. James was just ensuring HOA standards were being met. At 2 in the damn morning? She gives him a pointed look. We received complaints about excessive noise and unauthorized construction. Miles lets out a sharp laugh. That's a lie. Margaret's expression hardens. Perhaps. But you have no proof. She nods to clipboard guy James, who scrambles into her car. The engine purrs to life. I'd be careful, Mr. Carter, Margaret says, voice light but laced with warning. People are watching. With that, she drives off, leaving Miles standing in the dust, fists clenched. This isn't just about harassment anymore. She's trying to force him out. And now, it's war. Miles doesn't wait for another ambush. He's done playing defense. The next morning, he marches straight into the Willow Creek HOA meeting. The community center is packed, filled with retirees in pastel sweaters, golf dads clutching overpriced lattes, and housewives who treat neighborhood gossip like currency. Margaret stands at the front, a queen addressing her court, basking in their murmurs and nods of approval. Her smile falters when she sees Miles pushing through the crowd. Well, she says, feigning delight, what a surprise. Miles doesn't waste time. I want to address the repeated harassment of my farm. Margaret barely suppresses an eye roll. Harassment? My goodness, Miles. No one is harassing you. He glances around the room. Then maybe someone can explain why your HOA board members have been sneaking onto my property in the middle of the night? Gasps ripple through the crowd. Margaret lets out a light laugh. Oh, please. James was simply ensuring that community standards were upheld. Community standards? Miles folds his arms. You mean the same standards that don't apply to the actual HOA members? Because I've noticed your neighbor parks his RV on the street every weekend. No citations. The folks on Ridgewood have a whole garden shed violating HOA code. No complaints. But my farm, which isn't even under HOA control, suddenly has zoning concerns. Silence. Margaret's smile tightens. I understand you feel targeted, but I assure you we. Miles pulls out his phone, clicking a button. The TV screen behind Margaret flickers to life. Security footage. There, in grainy black and white, is James creeping along the fence line at 2 a.m. The next clip, him untying the coop latch. The room erupts. Margaret's face goes rigid, but before she can recover, Miles presses play again. This time, the camera catches something else. Margaret's SUV idling just beyond the trees, headlights off. Waiting. A woman in the front row gasps. Is that Margaret? Margaret's mouth opens, then closes. Miles crosses his arms. Would you like to explain why you were sitting outside my property in the dead of night? Her face flushes, but she forces a laugh. That proves nothing. I was just. You were just what? Miles steps forward. Making sure James upheld standards? Making sure my farm was handled? Margaret sputters. That footage is misleading. You don't have any real evidence that I did anything wrong. Miles doesn't blink. Oh, I have more. He pulls out another clip. This one? Audio. Margaret's voice, clear as day. Will make life difficult for him. He doesn't belong here. The room is deathly silent. Someone whispers, "Oh my God." Margaret's mask shatters. That's taken out of context. Miles tilts his head. What's the context for telling your board members to break into my farm? Margaret whirls on the crowd, desperate now. You all know me. I've given years to this community. I've made it what it is. Are we really going to let him? She stops herself too late. Him. The room shifts. People exchange looks. Some murmur. A man in the back clears his throat, suddenly fascinated with the floor. The weight of her words hangs in the air like thick smoke. Margaret sees it. Feels it. She's losing them. Miles lets the silence drag before delivering the final B. Low. I've already filed a police report, he says. Trespassing. Vandalism. Theft. And now? HOA fraud. He glances at a woman in the crowd, Sandra Patel, the only person on the board who's ever been halfway decent. I assume the board wouldn't want to be caught up in a legal scandal? Sandra stiffens, then gives a sharp nod. We'll discuss this internally, she says. Margaret spins on her. Sandra. But Sandra won't look at her. It's over. Margaret's power is slipping through her fingers like sand, and she knows it. Her face twists in rage, but there's nowhere to direct it. Not anymore. Miles gives her one last look. Enjoy your meeting. And with that, he walks out, leaving Margaret to drown in the fallout. Margaret Ellison has spent years ruling Willow Creek with an iron fist wrapped in a cashmere glove. She knows how to control a room, how to spin a narrative, how to turn neighbors against each other while keeping her own hands clean. But tonight, the leash has slipped, and the wolves are circling. Miles doesn't wait for the HOA to discuss things internally. He knows how these people operate: stall, cover up, sweep things under the rug. Not this time. By the next morning, the footage is everywhere. A local journalist picks it up first, one of those hyperactive young reporters who thrive on exposing corruption. Then the town's Facebook pages start buzzing. HOA president caught in trespassing scandal. Local black farmer harassed by neighborhood association. Property values or racism. Willow Creek's ugly secret. By noon, the story has blown up. People who never gave Miles the time of day are suddenly very interested in hearing his side. Even some of the HOA board members, Margaret's former lapdogs, start distancing themselves. And Margaret? She's furious. She storms into the HOA office, slamming doors and barking orders. Take it down. Issue a statement. This is slander. But there's a problem. The rest of the board isn't backing her up. Sandra Patel, the woman Margaret always dismissed as a spineless do-gooder, sits stiff-backed in her chair, arms crossed. It's not slander if it's true, Margaret. Margaret's eyes narrow. You're believing him over me? Sandra exhales, pinching the bridge of her nose. There's video evidence of James trespassing Margaret. And you were there. Margaret scoffs. This is ridiculous. I was monitoring the situation, ensuring things didn't escalate. Sandra just stares at her. You told James to make life difficult for him. We all heard it. The room is silent. Margaret's heart pounds. This isn't how things are supposed to go. They always side with me. Desperate, she switches tactics. All right, fine. Let's say mistakes were made. But I built this HOA. I've kept this neighborhood desirable. You're seriously going to throw me under the bus because some outsider made a fuss? Sandra's gaze hardens. Miles Carter isn't an outsider. He's a homeowner. And unlike you, he hasn't committed a crime. Margaret's breath catches. Crime? Sandra nods. Police are investigating. James already confessed. The bottom drops out of Margaret's world. Confessed. Sandra nods again. Said you pressured him into it. That you made it clear Miles' farm was a problem, and he needed to handle it. Margaret stares, her throat dry. He's lying. A voice from the doorway makes her jump. No, he's not. Margaret whips around. Miles. Calm. Steady. Watching her with the quiet patience of someone who's already won. And behind him, a uniformed officer. Her stomach plummets. This is absurd, she spits, trying to keep her voice from shaking. You can't prove I did anything illegal. The officer steps forward, a folded paper in hand. We can. Mr. Carter filed a trespassing complaint, and we've reviewed the footage. Given James Ellison's full admission, we're escalating this to criminal charges. You're coming with us, Mrs. Ellison. The world tilts. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. I have rights. I'll call my lawyer. Of course, the officer says, voice neutral. But for now, you'll need to come downtown. Margaret turns to the board. You're allowing this? No one meets her eyes. Her face burns. Everything she built, her reputation, her power, it's unraveling. And at the center of it all stands the one man she tried to erase. Miles Carter. Their eyes meet. He doesn't gloat, doesn't smirk. He just watches. A quiet storm. Then the cuffs click around her wrists. Margaret Ellison, the queen of Willow Creek, falls. The fall of Margaret Ellison is swift and brutal. By the time she's released on bail, her empire has crumbled. News stations pick up the story. HOA corruption, racial bias, criminal trespassing, it all makes for a juicy scandal. Residents who once whispered behind closed doors now voice their outrage openly. The HOA board holds an emergency vote. By the end of the week, Margaret is officially removed as president. She tries to fight back, of course. Threatens lawsuits. Claims she was set up. But it's useless. James Ellison, her former lackey, cuts a deal with the district attorney and testifies against her. The evidence is airtight. And then the financial blow comes. With her name dragged through the mud, property values start dropping. Real estate agents distance themselves. No one wants to be associated with the HOA that got exposed on the evening news. Margaret's husband, already humiliated by the scandal, quietly files for divorce. By month's end, her once pristine house sits with a for sale sign out front. She leaves Willow Creek in the dead of night. No farewell, no grand exit, just a fading ghost of the woman who once ruled the neighborhood. Miles doesn't celebrate. Not outwardly, at least. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about setting things right. And things are right now. With Margaret gone, the harassment stops. No more bogus complaints. No more surprise inspections. Just peace. One evening, as he's tending to the farm, Sandra Patel stops by. She looks sheepish, hands tucked into her pockets. I just wanted to say, she hesitates. I should have spoken up sooner. We all should have. Miles leans on the fence, studying her. Why didn't you? She exhales, shaking her head. Fear, I guess. Margaret had power, influence. And if I'm being honest, it was easier to believe she was just keeping order than to admit what was really happening. Miles lets the silence stretch. Then he nods. You're admitting it now. That's something. Sandra looks up, relief flickering in her eyes. We're voting on new leadership next week. I'd like to see someone like you on the board. Miles chuckles. I think I've had enough HOA drama for a lifetime. She laughs, nodding. Fair. Then more seriously. But if you ever need anything, we're here. Miles watches her go. Change is slow. But sometimes it happens. A week later, he's sitting on his porch, watching the sun dip behind the fields. The chickens peck lazily at the grass. The air smells of earth and hay and the promise of rain. Peace. He fought for it, earned it, and now it's his to keep.